The Old Gods of the Forest. Written by HeadOfSpectre. October 2nd. The hospital visits are still difficult. Even before all of this, I hated the sterile environment and the mechanical sounds of the machines. Seeing Matthew in that bed, though, bald, emaciated, dying. God, I've seen a lot of death. I've seen the worst of people. As a homicide detective, that's just part of the job. But cancer seems to be a much crueler death than murder. With murder, there is motive and purpose. What motive does cancer have? What purpose does it serve? There is no answer. It is just a cruel, apathetic decay that slowly eats away the best parts of a person until they are nothing but a husk. The worst part is that sometimes it leaves its victims with just enough hope to fight on until the bitter end. I'm not sure who suffers worse for that, the condemned or the ones who love them. Matthew had been my friend for as long as I could remember. He was always by my side, no matter what. I suppose I knew how he felt about me. I'd be lying if I said I never felt the same, but I didn't want to indulge. I didn't know what a relationship with Matthew would bring. I thought it would change the way things were. There would be different expectations. He would need something more from me. Something I didn't know I could give him. I convinced myself that he would have been happier with someone else. Someone who could have loved him the way he deserved to be loved. Someone who wasn't just using him like I was. How many times did I show up at his apartment, drunk and looking for an escape? He never once refused me, always welcoming me as I told him about the horrible things I had seen. When I fell into his arms, kissing him and coaxing him into his bedroom, he never once stopped me. He must have known I'd gone as soon as we were done. I always was, but he never said no. I didn't deserve him, and now at the end, all I could do was try to make up for lost time, and I could barely even do that. When I saw him last night, he lay half awake in his hospital bed. His voice was hoarse. His hair was gone. Cancer had taken everything away from him. But I still loved him. His eyes opened when he saw me, the corners of his mouth raised in a sad smile. "Hey, Karen," he said. The sound of his voice nearly broke me. But I sat by his bed and held his hand. "You shouldn't be here." "You have been there for me," I replied. He just smiled softly and looked out of his window into the courtyard of the hospice. We talked for a while about anything but the cancer. He could barely form the words, and watching him try was one of the hardest things I have ever done. If I could have spent the day there, I would have. But unfortunately, I did not have the luxury of time. "I'll come back and see you, okay?" I promised him. "Don't," Matthew said. He meant it. "I don't want to be remembered like this." "You won't be," I promised him. I stood up from my chair and leaned down to kiss his forehead. "I love you." There was something in his eyes when I said that. He smiled at me ever so slightly. "I love you too." I squeezed his hand before I left him, and I promised myself I would not be away for long. I don't know if this is going to work. Logically, it shouldn't, but I'm at the end of my rope. I only hope that Matthew can hold out a little bit longer, at least until I get back. If this works, then it won't be a problem. But if not, at least I said what I had to. The drive up to the national park was long and tedious. I took very few breaks, as I did not want to waste any time. I drove through the night. I'd booked some time away from work. I had no major outstanding cases, and unsure of how much time this would take, I'd taken care to request a few weeks away from work. I'd made my preparations accordingly. It was hard to say just how long I'd be alone in the wilderness. I brought enough dried food to last me a few weeks, a water bottle that I could refill. I also brought some metal cookware, basic toiletries, a tent, a sleeping bag, 2 bottles of whiskey, and my flask, among other things. As a precaution, I made sure to bring a pistol. Not my service weapon. This was one that I owned independent of my work. The woods could be dangerous, and I wanted to take no risks. The map I'd been provided led me deep into the park, down a dirt road that led to what should have been an empty clearing. I was expecting to be alone, but the sight of other cars took me by surprise. There were 3 of them. The occupants had clearly been there for a little while. A glance at them confirmed them to be backpackers, just like I was. 2 of them seemed to have a fire going. The third was off by himself. I parked my car away from all of them before I got out. I wasn't interested in socializing. All I wanted was to make one last check of my supplies to make sure everything was in order. Then I would head out before I wasted too much daylight. Looking back at the other campers, I noticed that the 2 by the fire were approaching me. I initially thought they were husband and wife, but the more I looked at them, the less certain I was of that. If they were married, they wouldn't have come in 2 separate vehicles. I tried not to theorize as the nature of their relationship. That wasn't what I was there for. I caught the 3rd camper looking at me. We made eye contact only briefly, but didn't linger. Well. Looks like we've got another new face, one of the 2 approaching campers said. She was a woman in her mid-20s. She had a petite build, pale skin, and black hair. Her smile was wide, toothy, and clearly practiced. Looking into her green eyes, I immediately picked up on the fact that she was studying me. I guess you're here for the backpacking hike too, huh? I wasn't aware it was a formal event, I said. The woman just kept smiling. Yeah, well, neither of us were, I'm guessing. Still, kind of a good thing we found each other, right? I'm Candace. It's nice to meet you, Miss Faraday, I replied. Candace had offered me a hand to shake, and I begrudgingly shook it. Just Faraday? She asked, never once dropping her smile. Karen Faraday. Well, it's nice to meet you, Karen. I'm guessing you haven't met my friend Tanner here either. The man shook my hand next. He was a tall man with a large upper torso and bushy beard. His arms seemed almost disproportionately long compared to his body. I'd noticed he had a slight limp as he approached me. Nice to meet you, he said softly. Tanner Hitchcock. I looked him in the eye, studying his face. That name sounded familiar. Nice to meet you too, I said. Tanner pulled back and stuffed his hands into his pockets as Candace resumed her control over this conversation. Anyways, when I ran into Tanner here, we got to talking. Since it's a long hike and arguably not all that safe out here, we should probably travel together, right? Might not be a bad idea. It's not, I said, although it begs the question of what you're doing out here alone. Candace's smile faltered for a moment. Well, honestly, I just love being out in nature, she said. Her pale, pasty complexion told me otherwise. It's really calming, you know? I wasn't planning to go that far, but with Tanner, our other friend over there, and you, we could probably make a hell of a trip out of it. As a homicide detective, people lied to me every day, but I could tell that it came naturally to Candace. Glancing at Tanner, I suspected he had no idea of what Candace was up to. Granted, I wasn't entirely sure either, although I had my suspicions. Still, Candace wasn't wrong. It would be safer to travel as a group for the time being. There were no obvious weapons concealed on her person, but my gun was holstered on my thigh. I was confident that if push came to shove, I could shoot Candace and be on my way without much hassle. You're right, I said. I suppose it would be nice to get a little more use out of this backpack, although we should head out soon if we're going to do it today. It's almost noon, so we have about 7 more hours of daylight. That's true, Tanner said. Candace, you want to do one last check? Make sure you're not forgetting anything. Oh, sure thing. You should go and let that man over there know we're headed out soon then. Don't worry, I'll watch your stuff. See you in a bit, Karen. Candace waved at me before turning to walk back to her car. Tanner lingered around me for a moment longer. I take it you're not with that guy over there, he asked, gesturing to the other man. No, I replied as I went back to checking my backpack. I assume he's coming with us? Says he is, Tanner shrugged. Didn't catch his name, though. Well, plenty of time for that on the trail, right? He smiled sheepishly before going to follow Candace back to his car. I watched him go, then looked at the other man in the clearing. He looked to be packed up and ready to head out. I reached for my flask and took a pull on it. Since I was no longer driving, there was no need to hold off on it any longer, and if I was going to have to spend time around the likes of Candace, I could use the liquor. My flask was jammed into my pocket before I shouldered my backpack and locked my car before approaching him. The weight of the pack wasn't too heavy, but it felt awkward. Are you here for the hike too? I asked. I'm not sure what made me want to talk to him. Perhaps I just wanted to get a read on him. Or perhaps it was just the fact that he wasn't Candace or Tanner and I hadn't particularly cared for either of them. If we were going to be hiking in a group, I wanted to know who I was dealing with. The man looked at me. He had a steely expression and a clean-shaven face. His black hair was messy and his green eyes had a familiar intensity to them. He wore a loose flannel shirt, but I could see a small silver knife on a chain around his neck. It was hard to tell if it was decorative or not. There was a certain tension in his posture. He recoiled a bit when I spoke. I recognized a frightened man when I saw one. Yeah, he said softly. I'm here for the hike. He glanced over at Tanner and Candace. I wasn't expecting to run into other people here. This spot seemed pretty secluded. Neither was I replied. From his tone, I got the impression that he hadn't been a fan of Candace and Tanner either. I suppose we can make the most of it, though. The company might be nice. I don't do well with company, the man said. Sorry. I should introduce myself. I'm David Van de Graaf. Karen Faraday, I replied. I was tempted to ask what brought him out that way, but I already knew the answer. Part of it, at least. The part that mattered. And what I didn't know was his business, and his alone. Do you hike much, Karen? On occasion, but not usually so late in the season. I haven't been backpacking in a few years, but I thought this would be a nice spot to pick it back up again. He scoffed. Yeah, hell of a spot, he murmured. Candace and Tanner were approaching us again. Both looked ready to go. Well, looks like no one else is coming, Tanner said cheerfully. Think we should head out? Were you expecting other people? I asked. Tanner's smile faltered a little. No, not really, he said. Seems like a popular spot today, though. I nodded in agreement before looking over to the tree line before us. There was no visible trail cutting into the forest. The green, red, and gold wall of trees beckoned to us with no clear path forwards. I could sense the others looking at it too, and I wondered if any of them knew where to start. A deep breath before the plunge. My legs moved me forward, bringing me to the edge of the forest. I passed through the pale birch trees, and I could hear the other three moving behind me. The hike had begun. The forest seemed peaceful. There was the occasional chattering of birds and the rustle of a small animal fleeing through the underbrush. Tanner and Candace seemed to end up ahead of me, while I found myself walking beside David. For the first hour, we didn't speak much. Tanner whistled a happy tune as Candace pushed on ahead, as if she was expecting to find something. When one of us finally broke the silence, I was surprised to hear that it was David. So, none of us are going to say it, huh? Say what? Tanner asked. briefly looking back at him. "Well, it's a little odd, isn't it?" David asked. "All of us coming here alone and running into each other? This isn't a regular trail, you know." "Well, what can I say? I like the thrill of it," Tanner said. "And what about you, Candace?" "Oh, yeah, great outdoors and all that," she said. I didn't bother chiming in. The others were clearly adamant that they deny the obvious, and I wasn't going to dispel the illusion without good reason. "You two get out a lot, do you?" David asked. "From time to time," said Tanner. "What about you?" "You could say I'm something of an outdoorsman." I zoned out from listening to David grill Tanner, and instead focused on the sounds of the forest around us. The trees stood tall as we made our way between them, and the terrain beneath our feet was uneven. I thought about reaching for my flask, but I didn't want to drain it too quickly. I only had 2 bottles, and I didn't know how long we'd be out there. Going through it all too quickly would be a mistake, and I didn't want my drinking to draw any unnecessary attention. The last thing I needed was an intervention from a bunch of strangers. Or worse, for them to see it as some sort of weakness. While David was the only one with a visible weapon, my new companions could have held all sorts of surprises. Candace was clearly a liar. Tanner was either stupid or very good at pretending he was, and I had yet to get a read on David. The day went by quickly, and I noticed the sky slowly getting darker as we continued onwards. There was a familiar exhaustion in my legs, but I didn't ask for a rest. We'd likely be making camp soon, and the more ground we covered before then, the better. The terrain was getting rockier. We'd started up a slight incline some time ago, and it wasn't letting up. I could see Tanner slowing down a little. His limp had gotten more pronounced, but he kept a steady pace. He had adopted a long stick as a hiking pole, and it seemed to cover his handicap. I looked around, taking in the world around me, and paused for a moment when I spotted a shape atop a small rock formation. The wolf was a good 50 feet away, and it stood stock still as it observed us. I should have expected to see some wildlife, but the sudden sight of a wild wolf put me on edge. "Noticed him, did you?" David asked me, and I looked back at him. He'd stopped beside me and was staring at the distant wolf. It turned and disappeared behind the rocks. "He and his friends have been following us for the past hour or so," he said. "I wouldn't worry about it. They're just curious. We're in their territory. Chances are they'll keep their distance." "You seem sure about that." "I've had some experience with wolves," he replied. "They're not so bad when you get to know them. Trust me." He started moving again, closing the distance between Tanner and Candace. They hadn't bothered stopping for us, and I reluctantly followed him. We stopped beside a small lake and made camp for the night there. I had been planning on a light supper for a dehydrated meal and some nuts, but Tanner seemed to have other plans. He'd brought a pack of hot dogs that he was willing to share, and we cooked them over the open fire. Though he had no buns or toppings, the sight of them and my hunger had made it impossible to say no. Candace chipped in with a bottle of vodka she'd brought. I recognized the brand. The bottle was in the shape of a skull. I thought it was an unnecessarily cumbersome thing to pack, but I didn't argue when she'd offered to share. Whatever tension had been felt throughout the day melted away quickly once food and alcohol got involved. Even I let my guard slip a little. "Hey, anyone know any good campfire stories?" Tanner asked. It was later in the night, and there were no immediate replies, but Tanner's enthusiasm wasn't quelled. "No, huh? Okay, well, I think I've got one. Any of you guys ever hear about the old gods of the forest?" I looked up at him. In the firelight, I could see that Candace and David had done the same. Tanner's eyes darted between each of us. "I don't think I have," Candace said softly. Her tone was different than before, more interested. "Well, it's not a story that you hear all that often," Tanner admitted. "But supposedly, back when the British came and settled this place, the native tribes told them not to enter these woods. They said there was something out here, something very old and very sacred to them. Now, the British didn't buy it. They dismissed it as just a bunch of pagan superstition, and history ran its course. But those stories still got to a few people who wanted to see for themselves. A lot of those people have gone into the woods over the centuries, and a lot of them have never returned. Most of those who came back and said that there was nothing out there. But according to the legends, A few came back and said something else entirely. The stories are a bit divided on exactly what they found, but the consensus is that something very old lives in these woods. Older than the natives, older than humanity itself. Gods. The firelight danced around Tanner's face. No one else spoke as he continued his story. According to those survivors, if you can find your way into the deepest parts of these woods, then you may just be granted an audience from the old gods of the forest, and if you can impress them, then they will reward you. They will grant you one boon, anything your heart desires, wealth, power, love. All you have to do is ask. In the light of the fire, I could see Tanner's eyes scanning all of us carefully, but none of us said a word. None of us, save for David. "You forgot to mention the part about the full moon," he said, and Tanner looked over at him. "Huh?" "The full moon. The story said that the old gods of the forest only ever came out during the full moon." I caught Candace's eyes shifting skywards, towards the waxing moon above us. I knew what she was thinking. "Right, the full moon," Tanner said sheepishly. He smiled at David. "I guess you've heard the story before." "Once or twice," David replied. He glanced at the night sky as well, looking up at the waxing moon before standing up. "We should get an early start tomorrow," he said. "Long day ahead of us." He retreated off to his tent, and I could see Candace watching him intently. Her smile returned as soon as he was gone. I finished my vodka and retired to my own tent soon after. I could still hear Candace and Tanner outside my tent, even though they tried to keep quiet. I could hear what they were doing inside of one of their tents as well. I suspect that Candace made the first move, and I doubt that she did it out of any real affection for the man. Tanner's mention of it confirms what I already suspected. It's no accident that we were all here together. It's almost comforting to know that I'm not the only one to buy into the rumors of the old gods of the forest. But I wonder, will we all be granted an audience? Or just one of us? I'm sure the others are thinking the same thing. I don't know what it is they're after, but I know that I have to be the one to find what's out there. For Matthew. October 3rd. Last night, I awoke to sniffing outside of my tent. I couldn't see any trace of the wolves outside, but I lie awake, clutching my pistol in anticipation of some sort of attack. The wolf outside my tent half-circled the perimeter. I thought I could hear others moving around the camp. It was likely that they were probably just investigating to see if we had left any food behind. I couldn't imagine they'd try and get into our tents. In the distance, I thought I heard a yelp. Then there was the sound of movement followed by silence. Something must have scared them off. I sat awake for a little while longer, but aside from the waves beside me and the chirping insects, there was no sound. I don't remember going back to sleep. I just know that I did. I woke up to Tanner screaming. I emerged from my tent as quickly as I could, pistol in hand and expecting signs of an animal attack. At a glance, though, everything seemed fine. Candace and David stood around Tanner, and David had his hands up, as if trying to calm him. "You!" Tanner snarled the moment he saw me. "Did you do this? Huh? Is this your idea of a fucking joke?" He gestured to something, and it took me a moment to make out just what I was looking at. A large birch branch was impaled in the ground by his tent. Several smaller branches were propped up against it. The placement was clearly deliberate, but that was not the most concerning thing about them. On the branch that the display centered around was the head of a wolf. It had been viciously impaled on the wood, and 2 birch branches had been forced through the skull in a manner that resembled horns. The mouth hung open, and the eyes stared vacantly ahead. I could only stare in shock at the sight. "You think this is funny, huh?" Tanner growled. "Well, it's fucking not, alright? You think you can scare me off with this Blair Witch shit? But I'm fucking on to you." "Tanner, please, just relax. Why would any of us try to scare you off?" I asked. I kept my voice level. He just glared at me. "Please, you want to tell me you didn't figure it out the second you saw the rest of us? It's obvious. It's been obvious right from the fucking start, so let's just all come out and say it, alright? You're here to see the old gods, just like I am. So what if we are? I replied. But what do any of us have to gain by scaring you off? You think the old gods do a group rate? Tanner snapped. In all of the stories I've heard, it's always one person alone who gets his audience. And it's gonna be fucking me, alright? I was here first. I've been waiting so long for this. So sorry, but I'm getting my boon. I swear, I've never even heard about the old gods, Candace stammered. It had to be one of them. Tanner fixed her in a glare, and I would have been content to let him go off on her next, but there was still the obvious to point out. She couldn't have done that. I heard the wolves outside last night. David and I noticed them at a distance before we made camp. As far as I can tell, Candace doesn't even have a weapon, and there's no way she took down a wolf with her bare hands. Well, what about you? Tanner asked, glaring at me. You've got that gun there. You could have done it. If I was shooting at the wolves, you all would have heard it, I replied. Tanner's eye settled on David next. I didn't do it, he said. If any of us were out there last night picking a fight with a pack of wolves, the rest of us would have heard it. If you want my opinion, I don't think this was any of us. Well, who else is out here? Tanner snapped. Other than the gods? David asked. I can't say for sure. Awfully suspicious of something to leave us a totem, though. Clearly it has meaning. As what, though? I asked. A warning? Perhaps. Or a taunt. We should pack up and keep moving. We're burning daylight, and clearly it's not safe here. Tanner continued to glare at him for a moment before huffing in frustration. He pushed past David without a further word, and went to go pack up his tent. David and I exchanged a glance, and I took one final look at the totem before getting ready to do the same. Tanner walked ahead of the rest of us as we advanced deeper into the woods. Candace had fallen slightly behind us, and I found myself regarding her warily. I knew she was lying about why she was out here, but I didn't understand why. I thought about the way she'd reacted to that totem. Immediate denial. There was no way she could have built it, but I wondered if she knew who had. Before noon, I ended up making my way toward the front of the group and kept stride with Tanner. Are you all right? I asked. He side-eyed me before sighing. Yeah, I'm all right, he said. Spooked, I guess. I paused before he added, sorry about this morning. I kind of went off on everyone. Fear does that to people, I said, especially when something you care about is on the line. Do you mind if I ask what you're looking for? There was a moment of hesitation before Tanner spoke. I just want a second chance, he said after a while. You know, a few years back I used to be a swimmer. I was good, man. I was an Olympian. I was going to take the gold in Rio. Then one night some asshole in a Jeep decides to run a stop sign, and I'm right in the middle of the crosswalk. He took my career. I've been training my entire life for Rio. Then in a few seconds, all of it was gone. The doctor said I'm lucky I didn't lose a leg. Am I? At least there's room for a one-legged man in the Paralympics. I could have gotten something out of it. I nodded slowly as I heard his story. It must be very hard for you, I said. Tanner laughed. You've got no idea. I just want one more chance. That's all I ask. One more chance. What about you? I hesitated for a moment, but Tanner had been honest with me. I owed him the same. Someone I love is very sick, I said. It's lung cancer, stage 4. Tanner didn't respond. He kept looking straight ahead, and I didn't blame him. What I'd said was not an easy thing to swallow. I see, he said after a while. He looked over at me, thoughtful for a moment before sighing. I'm sorry. I'm not going to turn back. But for what it's worth, maybe we'll get lucky. There's no part of the story saying we can't all get what we want. Maybe, I replied. If we're lucky. We camped out by a small rocky outcrop. Tanner seemed calmer than he had this morning, although I noticed him sitting away from Candace. I suspect he distrusts her as much as I do. She hasn't done much to alleviate our suspicions. The woods are thicker, and the air feels colder. I don't know how much farther we need to go, but I feel as if we're headed in the right direction. October 4th. Again, I woke up to screaming, but this was of a different nature. The sky outside was still dark, but as I emerged from my tent, I was blinded by a bright light. "Put some water on it, now!" I heard David shouting, and I could see him and Tanner emptying their water bottles onto one of the tents. In my hazy, half-wakeful state, it took me a moment to realize that the tent was on fire. Candace stood wide-eyed and useless in the corner, and I rushed to try and help the two men in extinguishing the flames. I could hear Tanner swearing under his breath. "What the fuck? What the fuck? Jesus fucking Christ, man! What happened?" I asked as the fire died down. "I don't fucking know. I woke up and... Fuck! My tent! Fuck!" Tanner paced around, clearly frustrated, and I caught him glancing at David and I. For a moment I thought he might blame us again, but he just shook his head. I caught myself looking at Candace, but despite my suspicions of the woman, I couldn't believe that she was behind this. David left my side to check on Tanner, and I looked down at the smoldering tent. In the low light of dawn, I crouched down beside it and reached into the burnt remains. "Did you see what caused it?" I called to Tanner. "No, I didn't see jack shit," Tanner yelled back. "I just woke up and... Fuck! From the ashes, I picked up what looked to be a birch stick. It had been burned and was still a little hot to the touch, but the shape of it was interesting. "Look at this." I brought my findings over to David and Tanner. David took the stick from me. "What is this? Where'd you find this?" "In the tent," I said. "Look at the ends of it." David held the stick into the light as he and Tanner examined it. The tip was sharpened to a point, and the other end had what appeared to be fletching. "This looks like an arrow," he said. "Fucking arrow," Tanner murmured. "Jesus. So what, fucking Robin Hood is out here trying to kill us?" "Or something else," I said. I looked up at Candace, furrowed my brow before leaving the men to approach her. "Did you see anything?" I asked. "No. I woke up, and there was just fire and screaming. Jesus." She rubbed at her temples. "I don't know what happened." I stared at her, but I didn't think she was lying. "We should pack up," I said. "Keep moving." "What about my tent?" Tanner asked. "You can share with someone, but I think it's best we keep moving." Tanner stared at me, and I could tell he wanted to argue, but he didn't, as we packed up quickly and left the ruins of his tent behind. As day broke, snow began to drift down between the trees. "Fucking perfect," I heard Tanner murmuring, but he didn't complain much beyond that. Candace had fallen to the rear of the group while David and I stayed near the front. "It's a little early in the season for snow," David said. "This doesn't feel right." "Should we take that as a sign that we're headed in the right direction then?" I asked. He huffed in approval. "The legend said that the old gods would test us. I wonder if this is what they meant. Perhaps. It's gotten quieter. Did you notice?" He nodded. "No birds, no animals. I don't think we're alone, though. Something ran the wolves off the other night, and it's been following us ever since." "No birds, no animals. I don't think we're alone, though. Something ran the wolves off the other night. It's been following us ever since." "Gods?" I asked. David shook his head. "No, but I'm not the only one who's noticed them." He glanced back at Candace, and I knew what he meant. It was about an hour later when we found the deer. I saw it up ahead at first, although I couldn't make out exactly what it was. But when I got close enough to see, I picked up my pace, approaching the thing before me. It was strung up between two birch trees, all four limbs splayed out. The chest had been cut open and hollowed out, but the bones had been left in place. The deer's head lolled to the side, its horns keeping it somewhat propped up. What did this? I approached the carcass slowly, but I didn't know what to make of it. "This wasn't for food," David said softly. This was a warning. Again, I looked at Candace, who stared up at the carcass with unease. This didn't seem like an act, but I approached her anyways. Any thoughts? What? She was shaking, and not from the cold. Someone left this for us. I'm willing to bet the same person erected that totem outside our camp and burned Tanner's tent. David says something's been following us. I want to know if you know what's out there. Why would I know? She asked. I'm just as lost here as you are. Are you? You're here despite saying you'd never heard of the old gods. But after all we've already seen, you haven't turned back yet. Clearly, there's something you're looking for out here, just the same as us. I don't care what it is, but if you know something that we don't, we deserve to be told. Candace bit her lip before looking past me at the deer. Fine, she said softly. Yes, I've heard about the old gods. Obviously, that's why I'm here, but I didn't hear a single fucking thing about wolf heads and gutted deer. I stared at her for a moment, thinking it over. Then I reached for my flask and took a long pull. I thought about threatening her, but that seemed like a step too far. I didn't know for sure that she was lying. All right, I said after a while. Let's move on then. I turned and walked away from her and made my way deeper into the forest. Slowly, the other three followed, and we did not stop to rest until night had fallen. We agreed to sleep in shifts. 2 of us would stay awake to keep a lookout, and 2 would sleep. David and Tanner took the first shift, and I hoped they'd be all right. Something told me we'd be getting another visit from our hunters. David woke me up at around 2 in the morning for my shift. Candace was already sitting by the fire, drinking from her water bottle, and she watched as I filled up my flask before joining her. Isn't it a little early to be drinking? She asked. It keeps me focused, I said before taking a pull. I was down to just a quarter of my bottle now. Candace just scoffed. Whatever you say, she murmured. She stoked the fire quietly, and I began to think she wouldn't talk to me at all. But then she spoke up again. So, I heard you're out here trying to save your boyfriend. Tanner told you? I asked, and she nodded. He's been asking what we're all after. I think maybe he's having second thoughts. As far as I can tell, David's kept his mouth shut on what he's looking for. Says it's something personal. Tanner told me all about his Olympic career, of course. And what about you? I asked. What are you after? Candace smiled sadly. Well, that's the $1 million question, right? Let's just say I've hit a run of bad luck. Lost a lot of money on cards, and I'd like to turn things around. I raised an eyebrow at her before shaking my head. It sounded like a stupid reason to be out in the woods, but telling her as much wouldn't achieve anything. Mind if I have some of that whiskey? She asked. I offered her the flask and watched her take a drink. Thanks. I've got a question. What happens if the gods will only appear to one of us? Do we pick each other off to decide who gets the honor, or do you think they're going to choose whoever gets to see them? I honestly don't know, I replied. I suppose we'll find out soon enough. Very soon, Candace said. The full moon is tomorrow night, you know. We're going to have to decide. And frankly, between the 2 of us, I like my chances. She grinned and passed my flask back to me. In the firelight, her smile seemed unsettling. The snow slowly drifted around her as she stood up and stretched. Hey, can you hold down the fort for a minute? I gotta use the ladies' room. She trudged off into the darkness, and I watched her go for a moment before looking back into the fire. I thought about accompanying her. The woods were dangerous after all, but there was a part of me that didn't care if anything befell Candace. 10 minutes later, Candace hadn't returned, and I heard the first movement in the trees. I looked up, hoping it was just Candace, but I couldn't see her in the dark. Slowly, I reached for my pistol and stood up. Candace? I called, but there was no answer. I thought I heard wind rustling through the dry branches. In the light of the fire, I could see the pale bark of birch trees around us, and I could have sworn I saw movement behind them. Then came the sound of the wind again, dry and scratchy, only it sounded wrong. It went on for too long and seemed to be getting closer. I saw something duck behind a tree, but I didn't get a good look as to what. Then I heard that noise again, and I felt a sudden stab of panic as I realized that it was not the wind. It was a voice. Something hit me on the back of the head. Stars exploded across my vision and I hit the ground. I saw figures emerging from the woods, tall, dark, and terrible. I could hear their dry, scratchy voices. I tried to raise my gun, but I was struck again, and for a moment, I lost consciousness. It must have been out only a few minutes, but when I came to, I was on my knees. A pale hand rested on my shoulder, and I could feel something sharp against my neck. I watched as Tanner was dragged, screaming, out of his tent, and the shadowy figures worked to do the same to David. There was no sign of Candace, and somewhere in the back of my mind I realized that she'd abandoned us. She'd said she'd liked her odds after all. Somehow she'd known what was coming, and she'd been all too happy to use us as a distraction while she slipped away into the night. David's tent was cut open, and I watched as the figures dragged him out. He writhed and kicked. Sounds he made seemed pained. At last, the figures dropped him. "Oh, fuck me," I heard Tanner say, and it took me a moment to realize why. In the firelight, I could see David's body shifting, growing. He let out a pained scream that sounded half human and half animal. The figures recoiled from him, and my eyes widened as David changed before us. Thick black hair coated his body, his hands curled into wicked claws, and his face seemed to slowly elongate into a canine snout. The thing that had once been David let out an enraged howl, and I could feel the creatures behind me pulling away in fear. David's green eyes settled on me, but only for a moment. In an instant, he bolted into the woods in pursuit of our attackers. Tanner hurried to his feet and grabbed me by the shoulder to force me up. Shit, Jesus, shit, we need to go. I couldn't argue with that. Tanner was already running and I bolted off into the woods too, but not in pursuit of Tanner. I was after David. I'd snatched my gun off of the ground and I could hear vicious animals snarling up ahead. "Karen!" Tanner called behind me, but I didn't care. Whatever he was, David was clearly on our side. I wasn't going to let him fight those creatures alone. It was so dark that I could barely see the ground in front of me, but as my eyes adjusted to the light, I spotted a massive black shape ahead of me. David's eyes gleamed in the light. I could see the silver dagger around his neck, and I could smell coppery blood in the air. I froze, wondering if I'd made a mistake, if David would attack me next, but he had other priorities. In the shadows, I could see the beast seize one of the dark figures by the throat. He let out a vengeful howl before his teeth tore into its skull. I could hear the panicked whispers of our attackers among the trees, but their fear of David was too great. They would not engage him openly. Those whispers grew distant before they faded away entirely. David panted and fell to his knees before me. His eyes settled on me, and I heard a pained cry escape from him. I took a step back before I heard footsteps rushing up behind me. A flashlight shone upon David, now naked and shivering as his body contorted into its original shape. He looked up at us, clearly afraid, and I ran to his side. "Holy shit," I heard Tanner say softly. "Help me get him back to camp," I said, looking up at him. "He's going to need some clothes."
October 5th. We started moving again before the sun was up. We left the tents behind, along with everything that had belonged to Candace. We took only what we needed to survive. A quick check through her tent had revealed nothing of value, and none of us cared if we ever saw her again. David kept ahead of us, as if he was avoiding us, and I tried my best to catch up with him. The snow was getting heavier now. The light of day was just starting to break. "So, is that what you're here for?" I asked. David just kept walking. "Sooner or later, you'll have to talk about it," I said. "What we saw back there, you can't just dismiss it." "I'd like to," he replied. "Look, let's just say I've got an affliction, all right? I'd like to get rid of it. That's why I'm out here." If anything, he sounded embarrassed. I suppose I understood why. "For what it's worth, your affliction saved our lives back there," I said. He chuckled humorously. "Well, we can't all be bad, but trust me, enough of it is. We're lucky it's so close to the full moon. It's easier to change right now." "And what happens during the full moon?" He paused. His hands went to the silver dagger around his throat. I don't know. When I'm changed, I'm still me. For the most part anyways. I'm wired, running off instinct. But I'm hoping that if I get the chance, there'll be enough of me in there to commune with the gods. Maybe, just maybe, they'll lift this curse. If they don't, I've got an alternative." He took the dagger off his neck. "That's why I don't want other people around. It's easy to lose control. When I saw you in the woods last night, all I could think about was the blood rushing through your veins, the way it would feel on my tongue. If I slipped, if I wasn't in control." I nodded slowly, and David sighed. "You know, I read somewhere that silver can kill any supernatural being. I thought that if push came to shove, it could kill me too. I could wear it around my neck, and if someone needed to, they could kill me." He offered me the dagger. I stared at it quietly. "You trust me with this?" I asked. "You weren't running after me to kill me last night, and you've had your shot ever since I changed back," he replied. "Besides, as of right now, you and Tanner are the only people who know. I don't think he could do it." I glanced back to see Tanner a short distance behind us, having stopped to relieve himself. I took the dagger and slipped it into my pocket. "If it comes to it, I'll do what I have to," I promised. David seemed satisfied with that answer. It wasn't too long after that we found Candace. First, I barely recognized her, but when I saw the dark red against the white of the snow and birch trees, I felt a familiar sinking feeling in my gut. David stopped in his tracks beside me. She'd been stripped naked and hollowed out, just like the deer had been. Her arms and legs were splayed, leaving her carcass on display for us to see. Her head rested on her shoulder, eyes wide as if she were still surprised by her killer. David and I stood and stared at her as Tanner caught up behind us. "Holy shit." "She went off on her own," I said. "I guess her odds weren't so good after all." I reached for my flask and took a long pull on it. Far in the distance, behind Candace, I saw something standing in between the trees. It was not like one of the things I had seen last night. This creature was much taller, and I could see its beady eyes shining in the darkness. It was watching me, studying me, seeing how I'd react. Silently, it turned and skulked off into the depths of the forest. I looked over at David, but he didn't seem as if he'd seen it. I didn't want him to worry by mentioning it either. Instead, I kept walking, leaving Candace behind. The woods felt too quiet now, but they did not feel empty. I could have sworn I saw movement behind every tree. The virgin snow before us indicated that no one was ahead of us, but I still did not feel safe. As the snow drifted down lazily around us, I felt like I was being watched, hunted. But there were no animals out there, nothing except us and pale birch trees as far as the eye could see. They jutted out of the ground like pale skinny fingers and seemed to be reaching for us. At my side, David kept quiet, but I could see his eyes always moving. "They're still following us," he said. The answer to the question I'd never asked. "I can smell them." It wasn't long afterwards that we began to hear the drums. They were distant, but nevertheless they were there. A small beacon of civilization amongst the loneliness of the forest. But it felt more ominous than welcoming. They were fast and aggressive. "Tell me I'm not the only one hearing that," Tanner murmured. "I hear it too. It's distant," David said. "Getting further away, but still too close." I stood still and quiet, listening as the drums echoed through the trees. "Better be having a fucking party," Tanner said. "Of a sort, I think," I replied. "They sound like war drums." "War drums," Tanner repeated, and he laughed. "Oh, great. So that means we've pissed them off, right? Like, they're gonna come for us in force tonight, aren't they?" "More than likely," David said. "We're in their territory now. From their point of view, they're within their rights to defend it." "And we're within our rights to defend ourselves," Tanner snapped. His expression softened as he did. Both David and I were looking at him. "I'm sorry, I didn't." "You're scared," I said. "That's fine. Fear is a natural response, especially during times like these. I'm scared too, but fear won't help us. We all made a choice to come here. We need to follow through." I did not need to remind him what the alternative was. The image of Candace's body was still fresh in our minds. Tanner didn't reply. The look on his face was one of swallowed pride, and he avoided meeting my eyes. When I began to walk again, he kept pace behind me, limping slightly as he did. After about a half hour, I'd fallen in beside the man. I let David lead us on in our directionless pursuit. "I'm sorry if I came across harshly. I'm not trying to scare you even more," I said. "You don't have to try at this stage," Tanner replied dryly. "This was a mistake. This fucking trip was a goddamn mistake. I should have never listened to those stories." "Desperation can drive people to do things they regret," I said. "That's why I'm here, isn't it? That's why David is here." "But you're both prepared for this," he said. "And you both deserve this more than I do. I'm not a cop. I'm not a fucking werewolf. I'm just a guy with a backpack who couldn't accept that his career was done." "I'm just a girl with a crush who can't accept that he's going to die," I replied. "You can simplify it all you want. You can beat yourself down. But at the end of the day, you're out here with us. Maybe we can't all receive our boon, but at least the rest of us can walk out of here alive. Maybe you can still do something with your life." Tanner was quiet for a moment as we walked. "Maybe," he said softly. "Garen?" David had stopped ahead of us, and I moved past Tanner to rejoin him. "What's going on?" I asked as I approached, but there was no need for David to answer my question. I saw for myself. The forest was a little less dense ahead of us. The trees were more spread out, but between them I could see structures scattered around. The sight of them seemed so surreal, and I remained rooted to the spot for a moment. I couldn't get an accurate count of how many there were. They almost resembled tipis, but they were made entirely of birchwood, stacked neatly and bound together to create large conical tents. Many of them were built around tall birch trees, and it was evident that some space had been cleared to make room for this little village. "I guess we found their home," David said softly as he advanced deeper into the village. "It would seem so," I replied. I spotted a nearby structure made of stone and approached it. I could see smoke drifting out of it, and could smell something cooking inside. The light of a fire danced in the darkness of the entrance. "Karen?" David asked. I looked back to see him and Tanner a few feet behind me. "I'm just looking," I assured them. "Stay close and keep your ears open." David gave me a reproachful look, but he did not argue as I continued to approach the smokehouse. The inside was plain but spacious. The ceiling was incredibly tall, and the dirt floor had a fire pit set in the middle of it. A freshly stoked fire roared inside. I could see various pieces of meat spitted over the fire and crouched down to study them. Though the meat was blackened, my eyes widened as I realized what I was looking at. A heart, liver, kidneys, and a uterus. All of them looked to be fresh, and I had seen enough autopsies to recognize human organs when I saw them. I stumbled back a few steps, a hand over my mouth in revulsion. My stomach heaved, trying to reject the light breakfast I'd had. I fought to keep it down. On the dirt floor beside me, I spotted a pile of torn clothes and animal skins. I recognized part of Candace's jacket, and it only confirmed a truth I'd already known. Taking one last look at her roasting organs, I made my way over to her shredded clothes. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just anything that could have been of use. When she fled camp last night, she had not thought to bring much with her beyond a few days' worth of supplies, nothing more than she could carry discreetly. However, even amongst those supplies, I was a little surprised to find a journal much like my own. I looked over at her roasting organs again before deciding that it didn't much matter if I opened it. I skimmed through her entries. The earliest ones were dated from a few months prior. I've included some experts here. June 11th. What I've read on the old gods say that they are not accustomed to appearing before just anyone. I've heard a few mentions regarding striders. Different sources have called them by different names. Dryads, the children of the deep woods, and various other titles. But the descriptions always seem to match. I guess it makes sense that whatever's out there isn't just the old gods. Someone has to be there to keep out the rabble. Seems to me that that's what the striders do. June 29th. I've been hearing more whispers about the old gods of the forest. It's good to hear that people are getting the word out. I've called in an old gambling debt from one of the park rangers. He's monitoring where people go when they enter the park for me, and he'll let me know if anyone stops by that one clearing. If I'm right, the path to the old gods should be there, and the full moon will be coming shortly. Hopefully somebody shows. July 9th. The first group still hasn't come back. I'm thinking that they either got lost or something else found them. I'm placing my bets on the latter. I'm making plans to deliberately send in a second group out next month. I want to be sure. If the striders are out there guarding the old posts, I need to know what I'd be up against. August 6th. The second group has been doing pretty well, all things considered. I told them about the striders, although they don't seem to have encountered anything within the past few days. I'm starting to feel a little discouraged. August 8th. I saw the footage today. One of the GoPros captured footage of something moving through the woods. 3 of them have gone dark. I assume they're dead. I guess that's a few grand I get to save. My wallet will thank me for that. The last one was able to slip away in the commotion. Doesn't seem like the striders are all that smart. September 2nd. The striders became more active around the full moon. I think my prodding has riled them up a little. I'll up the price and pay another group of idiots to poke around and see how things go. If it goes as well as last time, I doubt I'll even have to pay them. But I think that come October, I won't be able to wait any longer. My debts are getting impatient. I've been trying to turn things around at the tables, but I'm running out of money. I can slip past the striders, so long as they're distracted. Then I can get an audience with the old gods. I'm out of options. October 1st. I've set up a camp in the clearing. I'll wait until a decent number of people show up, then we'll all go in together. When the striders come, I'll let them take them. I packed a gun for emergencies, but it's better to keep it hidden. Better to play the fool and let the patsies lead. Hopefully it won't be a long hike. The full moon is close, and if I don't come up with something soon, my debts aren't going to be happy. What I read disgusted me. Of course Candace had known all along. We'd been there as bait for her, so she could petition a god to get rid of her gambling debts of all the stupid things. I stuffed her journal into the back of my jacket, took one final look at Candace's remains as they burned. Any pity I had for her was long gone, and I left the smokehouse quietly. "Everything all right?" Tanner asked quietly. He'd gotten nearer to the building. "What's in there?" "What is it?" Tanner asked. "Meat," I replied. "Human meat." David grimaced beside him, before glancing around at the trees. "Best to leave it," he said softly. "We're clearly not wanted here already. I'd hate to disturb their things." I thought about sharing what I'd learned about Candace with them, although this hardly seemed like the place. "We should keep moving," David said. "I can still smell them on the wind. They're close by." Tanner paused, looking around as David said that. "Then let's go," I said. I brushed past both of them and continued onwards toward the edge of the village. But ahead of me, I saw movement. A tall, lanky figure darted between the trees. David saw it too. They're already here. Suddenly, the booms roared to life around us. They seemed to be coming from the forest itself, and their booming noises seemed to set my skull alight with pain. "Run!" I remember screaming, and the others did not need to be told twice. I looked back only once, and when I did, I saw countless figures standing in the village, where we had been a mere seconds ago. I could not see them clearly, but I made out hollow eyes and pale legs beneath deer skins and antlers. We disappeared into the trees. I was running faster than I ever had in my life, and yet I could hear the chittering voices behind me as we were hunted. I glanced to my left, but I could not see David nearby. I could hear Tanner beside me, so I knew he was still there. But there was no sign of David. Panic seized me. Had they gotten him? Was he dead? I could not dwell on my thoughts as adrenaline kept my mind focused only on escape and survival. Ahead, I could see nothing but more trees, but the ground beneath me gave out a little. I only stopped myself in time to avoid going down a steep incline. Shit, I heard Tanner murmur. An arrow whistled past us and we both looked back. Amongst the trees, I could see glowing eyes and figures approaching us. They weaved between the birch trees masterfully, keeping us from getting a good look at them. I didn't know how many there were. I drew my pistol, but at that range, and without a clear shot, it wouldn't do me much good. "We need to jump," I said, and grabbed Tanner's arm. "Come on!" "No!" He pushed me off of him. "I'm not going." "They're coming! They'd follow us down." I looked at Tanner to argue, but his face was calmer than it should have been. He looked at the advancing creatures with a stern expression. He didn't need to say it. I knew what he was thinking. "It was never going to be me anyways," he said softly. Before I could protest, he threw his weight against me. Then I was falling. I looked up at him as I toppled over the incline. Tanner looked more at peace than he'd been since the day we'd set out, and I knew that his choice had been deliberate. I hit the ground and rolled until I reached the bottom of the incline. I was dizzy and shaken, but alive and unharmed, save for a few bruises. I could hear the chittering voices above me, and they were soon intercut by Tanner's horrible screams. My heart seized in my chest, but I didn't linger. He'd made his choice, and he was beyond saving now. I only hoped that it had been quick. On unsteady feet, I started to run again, disappearing into the thick birch trees as the snow drifted down lazily around me. I felt like I was running for hours. I could still see daylight far ahead of me, but the woods were dark. The trees around me were thick and old. I felt as if I had shrank and my lungs burned with exhaustion. Slowly, my energy tapered out, and I slowed to a walk. The striders were nowhere near me, but neither was David. I didn't know where he was anymore. The air around me seemed so much colder. My coat barely shielded me from the chill in the air, and I wrapped my arms around myself in a desperate attempt to try and hold in my warmth. I stepped over broken trees as the canopy above me grew thicker than it had before. The white birch trees around me made me uneasy. With every step, I anticipated movement between them. Perhaps movement would have been a mercy, but instead, the world around me was dead silent. There was nothing to be seen out there. Not at first, anyways. Then, as I continued my slow, uncertain trek, I stopped as I spotted something between the trees. Another corpse, strung up just like Candace had been. But this one was far older. It was mostly bone. The flesh had rotted away long ago. As I stared at it, I spotted a second corpse further behind it, and a third. I looked around me, and in the shadows, I could see countless strung up corpses amongst the broken trees. Most of them were old, but some of them were more recent. Looking at the carcass of a young man, I realized that this must have been one of the people Candace sent out to verify if the old gods were real. His half-lidded eyes stared emptily up at the sky above, like Jesus on his cross. This place felt like a trophy case, a sick memoir to victims claimed. I wondered if this had been the work of the Striders, but something seemed off. The village I'd just seen had been organized. There were signs of some sort of culture. While its denizens were brutal, they had not just been savage creatures. They had been intelligent. There was intelligence in the way those bodies were strung up, and yet there was more to it than that. This felt like something else entirely. Looking up at the trees around me, a pit formed in my stomach as I saw the state of the branches around me. Many of them were broken, as if something massive regularly passed between the trees. Entire trees looked to have been splintered as if attacked in a vicious rage, and as I looked at the area around me, it occurred to me that this place seemed less like a graveyard and more like a battleground. Suddenly, I understood. These were the ones who had failed. This was their punishment. They had come into the forest for one reason or another, seeking a boon from the old gods of the forest, and they had been unable to defeat their final, greatest trial. In the distance, I heard heavy footsteps, and I rushed towards the nearest tree, hoping desperately that it could hide me. I could see it clearly as it moved through the forest. The trees kept its shape obscured, but I could still see it, and I could recognize it, although only barely. This was the same thing I had seen earlier in the day, hiding in the trees when we discovered Candace's body. The creature stalked through the woods, and a part of me feared that it was coming to add another trophy to its collection. Had it encountered David? Had it killed him? No, the creature didn't seem interested in stopping. It moved onwards towards another errand and disappeared into the darkness just as quickly as it had appeared. Its footsteps faded away slowly until finally there was nothing but wind and silence. When I was sure I was alone, I turned and continued to walk in the other direction the creature had gone in. I wasn't ready to meet it. Not yet. I wasn't looking for the clearing, but when I saw the light through the trees, I had to investigate. Like everything else, it was dead silent. A small pond near the middle and the trees surrounding it were mostly bare save for a few autumn leaves that stubbornly held on despite the unseasonal weather. The sky was getting dark. Twilight was setting in. Karen? I paused when I saw a figure moving through the woods. David! I ran to him and stopped just short of throwing my arms around him in a hug. He had no such reservations. You're alive, he said softly. I thought I was the only one left. I fell while we were running. I lost track of you and... He paused, pulling back a little. Tanner. Gone, I replied. The Striders got him. Striders? I took Candace's journal from my pocket. I found this in the village, along with some more pieces of our old friend. I only skimmed it, but it's enough to know that Candace already knew what we were walking into. David's brow furrowed before he shook his head. God damn it. I knew she was playing us. And look how well it worked out for her, I replied. For the first time, I allowed myself to look around the clearing. David huffed in agreement. Well, regardless, I'm glad you made it out alive at least. I was going to make camp here. I was a little afraid of doing it alone, though. Something about the air here. It feels different. In a good or bad way? I asked. I'm not sure. Good, maybe. I don't sense any danger if that's what you're asking. I looked around the clearing. It seemed peaceful enough, and it would be dark soon. Let's try and start a fire then, I suggested. Then, I suppose we wait. I helped David gather up whatever wood we could find. Getting a fire started was harder than it normally was. The wood was too wet, and when we couldn't get anything going, I emptied the last of my flask into the pile of kindling that we had and struck a match. It wasn't the ideal situation, but at least it allowed us to start a fire. When the alcohol had burned away, the wood had caught. The sun was quickly fading, and David looked out towards the birch trees as we warmed ourselves by the fire. Are they still out there? Yes, he said. I could hear them moving through the trees. More than were there last night. We're in their territory now, and they're watching us. This is a place where man is not meant to be. They want us gone. I slowly nodded before sitting down in the snow beside him. As long as we've still got each other, I think we should be fine, I said. David huffed in agreement. Maybe. What do we do if the gods won't take us both? We'll figure something out, I replied. But there's always an answer. I am writing this now, as I do not know what will happen next. This may very well be my final entry, but that is fine. I've come so far, I would do it again. I know now that the old gods of the forest are real, and I can only hope that they will grant me my wish. Please.
October 6th. I used to think about the life I could have had. I'm in my mid-30s now, and aside from my career, I don't have much to show for it. Most of my friends are from work, and Matthew was the only one I didn't have to put on a face around. He was the only one I could have talked to or trusted. He was the one who would have dropped everything for me, no matter what. When he told me he loved me for the first time, I didn't know what to say to him. It had been so difficult for him to admit it, and I could tell he was afraid I'd reject him. I suppose in a sense I did. Our friendship never changed in any overt way, and I didn't try and see anyone else. But there was something between us. He never pressured me. He never made me feel like I had to reciprocate a thing. We both agreed we were free to find other people, but neither of us ever did. In the end, he was left waiting for me, and I was too afraid that he was wasting his affection on me to make a move. What would have happened if things had played out differently? Would I be married by now? Would we have had children together? I'd never really had much of a family before, and I was never sure if I wanted one. Matthew was the closest thing I had, but it wasn't the same. Not really. Would the cancer have still been there, eating him alive? Would I still be losing him? You could spend your entire life dwelling on what-if questions. I always tried not to, but at the end, I couldn't help but wonder. What if things had been different? As soon as the sun disappeared beneath the trees, they came. I had expected them to wait until we were asleep, but we were already deep in the heart of their territory. They didn't need to wait. The hunt was over, and now it was time for the kill. David sat placidly by the fire we'd made. I hadn't bothered setting up my tent, and he'd lost his during his flight from the Striders. I shared what food I had left. There was enough to go around, so we ate like it would be our last meal. No need for meager rations considering what we were staring down. The dehydrated meals I had were hardly luxurious, but they were enough to fill us up. It was a shame that the whiskey was gone. It would have made a nice complement to the meal. I could see movement amongst the trees as we sat around the fire. Just a few of them at first, darting between the trees as they spied on us. They whispered amongst each other, unconcerned that we could hear them. Where would we run? We were cornered. "I smell them," David said before I could comment on them. "How many?" "Enough." He sighed and stood up, staring into the woods. "They'll be coming soon enough, when they're sure they can win." I absent-mindedly reached for my pistol, and David eyed it quickly. "I take it you've just got the clip?" he asked. "Yeah, I figured it would be good in a pinch. Wasn't expecting anything like this, though." "None of us were. I don't think even Candace understood what's out here." "Not really." David sighed, sitting tense by the fire as he awaited his change. I approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. I felt his tension fade ever so slightly. "Whatever happens, I'm glad I got to meet you," I said. David looked up at me, offering a weak smile. "Me too," he said. He stood up, his eyes meeting mine. In the firelight, his sad eyes reminded me a lot of Matthew. Shadows moved through the trees, and the whispers got louder. I could hear distant footsteps thudding against the earth, and I looked back. Figures dressed in deerskins had crept into the clearing. They were unashamed of their presence, and doing nothing to hide themselves now. No need for scare tactics. No, they were here for a fight. David stood up as the first of the creatures entered the clearing, and I stood at his side. I'd fought for my life before. I had found myself staring down the barrel of a gun before, with men who would have been happy to kill me again on the other side. This felt no different. Above us, I could see the moon, bright and full. I could hear David letting out a low groan as the change took him. The sound was pained and weak. He fell to his knees as his bones began to contort. Up close, the details were horrid to observe. Fur bristled out from his bare skin, and his features contorted into those of a wolf. His mouth opened, allowing jagged canine teeth to force their way out of his gums. His hands grew, distorting into claws, and his clothes tore at the seams. I took a step back out of reflex as the wolf was set loose. David fell onto all fours, seeming more animal than human. His eyes darted over to me, fixating on me for several moments. They were the same shade of green. They were human eyes. He was still in there. The scratchy voices of the creatures grew louder as they murmured amongst themselves. But the sight of David in his new form did not stop their advance. In the firelight, I could start to make out the features of the Striders. They stood upright like people, but their skin was pale like the bark of the birch trees. Their long and spindly limbs looked malnourished and feral. Some of them wore deer skins like armor. The horns of the deer rested proudly atop their heads, but none of them hid their faces, gaunt and almost skeletal. They had no noses, just an empty triangular pit. Their eyes were sunken and seemed hollow. They either had no lips or their lips were pulled back in a dreadful sneer. They were so horribly pale, and their skin looked like birch bark. Of course, they had blended in so seamlessly with the trees. They seemed like corpses that had been carved from the trees themselves. The weapons they carried were primitive. Clubs and spears made out of dead wood. Crude, but effective enough for their purposes. Behind their ranks, I spotted something else. Just one singular being, taller than the others. I could see its beady eyes in its sunken sockets and its bared fangs. I could only see its eyes glowing like hot embers and its tall deer-like horns. The being lurked behind the Striders as if it were a general surveying its ranks. I saw the Striders moving away from it, as if in fear or reverence. As I looked into those burning eyes, I knew what it was that I was looking at. This wasn't just their leader. No, this was something greater than that. This was their god. David let out a fierce snarl before unleashing himself upon the creatures. He threw himself into the forest, tearing at anything that crossed his path. The unfortunate ones did not have the time to flee from him before he tore them to shreds. The others stabbed and struck him with their weapons. David let out a howl of pain before he vanished into the darkness. His assault did not distract the other creatures. I had no idea how many there were lurking in the woods, but there were more than I could count. The old god lurked behind the trees at the edge of the clearing, seemingly unconcerned by David's assault, although it kept clear of him. I could see a few of the creatures shambling from out between the trees, and I raised my pistol, taking aim at the ones I could see. My bullets did enough to kill them, but it seemed that for every one I killed, another took its place. The creatures crept in slower. The few I'd killed meant nothing to them. They had numbers and time. Before I knew it, I'd fired 7 of my 12 shots into the slowly advancing army. But they did not care. They did not slow. I stumbled back a few steps. My clip had gone quickly, leaving me with only 5 more rounds. There were more than just 5 coming for me. There were more than I could handle with just a gun. Sooner or later, they would get me. In the distance, I could hear David fighting them, but I could not see him. The snow was starting to pick up, and I could see our modest fire dying as the wind and cold beat it down. One of the Striders rushed for me, letting out a triumphant cry as it did so. I shot it in the head and watched it fall, but its bravery had inspired its comrades. They came all at once, and I fired 2 more shots. At least one of them killed, but both were wasted. 3 bullets left and no more room for error. I turned and ran, trying to put some distance between myself and the Striders. The edge of the clearing was just ahead of me, and the trees welcomed me, just as they always had. Behind me, I could hear the Striders pursuing me. The sounds of their battle with David had faded into the distance. Now, all I could hear were their dry, scratchy voices as I fled into the night. Ahead of me, I thought I saw movement, and I fired at it. I don't know if I hit anything. A sudden screeching caught me by surprise, and I felt something pulling at my jacket. I was forced to the ground and saw one of the Striders standing over me, wooden spear in hand. Its skeletal face was frozen in a grin of victory as it raised the spear to drive it down into my chest. One hand held the back of my coat, keeping me in place. I could hear its kin approaching. There was no escape. Not really. I raised the gun and put a bullet in the Strider's head. It fell gracelessly to the ground, but as I attempted to stand, I found its grip on my jacket had not relinquished. More were coming. I could see their eyes burning in the distance, and I did not have the ammunition or ability to handle them. I made a spur-of-the-moment choice, unzipping my jacket and abandoning it as I fled deeper into the woods. The cold bit at me as I ran with the ebb and flow of the landscape. The distant sounds did not seem to be getting any further. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement and skidded to a stop. A looming shape towered over me, and I looked up to see burning eyes in the darkness. I raised my gun, but the shape was faster. A massive hand grabbed my head, and those burning eyes leaned in. Closer and closer. In those eyes, I could see everything. I saw the history of that place, the birth of the forest, the gradual growth of the trees, the death and rebirth of everything inside of it. A landscape distorted as it was reshaped by erosion and time. I saw countless fools striking out into the wilderness in search of a god. I saw the ones who'd turned around defeated, and the ones who'd pressed onwards to the point of insanity. I saw their deaths at the claws of the thing before me. It tore them to shreds as they tried to run. It gutted them alive and strung them up. I could hear their screams of agony as they died, over and over and over again. I caught a glimpse of Candace, backing away from the creature and looking up in horror during her last moments before it ripped her open. I saw myself staring at it through the trees. I saw the forest around me dying at the end of time, and a cold, dark, empty planet void of life. Then, I was falling. I hit the ground with a thud, and could only watch as the creature turned and disappeared into the woods. All around me, I could hear the Striders coming at me through the forest. On unsteady feet, I stood up again, ready to run. "Do you think you can outrun them?" From the darkness, a face appeared amongst the trees. Candace grinned at me. Her body sat there strung up between the trees, but she seemed alive. "What? No, you're dead." "Indeed I am. And soon you will be too." The Striders were getting closer. I could hear them mere feet behind me. The apparition cackled as I turned and ran. The laughter followed me deeper into the woods, along with the chittering of the Striders. Somewhere far away, I could hear their war drums starting up again. I could hear arrows flying through the night, but I could not stop to verify any of it. "Nobody's ever beaten it before," Candace whispered to me. I could see her face amongst the trees as she kept pace with me. "You can't defeat them, and you can't outrun them. Give up. The process is quick. The feeling of having your body opened is bliss." The ground beneath my feet gave out, and I landed face down in the snow. My eyes opened, only for a moment, but when I opened them, I was someplace else. My arms were bound, so were my legs. The Striders stood around me as their god approached from the forest. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't get free. The bindings were too tight. They bit into my skin and drew blood. Their god towered over me, hidden in the shadows. One massive hand reached out, tipped with claws as long as my arm. Then in one violent slash, white-hot pain erupted throughout my body. I was screaming as I was eviscerated. My bones cracked as I was torn apart, and I remembered seeing a pile on the ground beneath me. Entrails, liver, kidneys, uterus. Oh, God. The trees were pulled. I was opened, but I was not dead. Not yet. My brain was still fully conscious. My heart was still racing as I was left on display with the rest of the corpses. The air was so cold. The pain was so much. It hurt. I was fading. I was crying as I felt their god consume my rapidly beating heart. I pulled myself off the ground, screaming. My clothes were wet with snow, but I was alive. In the distance, I could hear either wind or laughter. Looking up, I saw burning eyes in the trees above me. As soon as I looked at them, they vanished into the darkness. It's fucking with me, I thought. The gun rested uncomfortably in my hand as the wind howled around me. I checked the clip. 2 bullets left. I needed to make them count. The drums roared to life again, and I could see Candace strung up between the trees. I could see Tanner and David on either side of her, and behind them, legions of other victims. Look at us, Karen. So lonely without you. They came looking for their own selfish ends too, and look where it got them. No, this is for Matthew. Is it? You're here to save him now, after the way you've treated him? He was nothing but a quick fix, a shoulder to cry on, a helping hand, a convenient fuck. You don't give a damn about Matthew. It's all about you. The ropes around Candace's wrist snapped and she launched herself towards me, mouth opening inhumanly wide. I aimed my gun at her, but I didn't know if shooting her would even stop her. Instead, I stumbled backwards and turned to try and run. Oh, isn't it funny? Karen storms into the forest and demands to speak to the manager because she can't handle little Matthew's death. Don't worry. You'll see each other soon. The air was filled with the sound of Candace's demonic cackling and the horrible chittering of the Striders. I only stopped when I found myself at the edge of the ravine, a shallow pocket in the earth, about 12 feet deep. My eyes darted around frantically, looking for a way around, but there was none. Jump, Candace whispered in my ear, and I felt her cold hands on my back before she shoved me over the edge. As I tumbled down, I felt the gun slip out of my hands, and I landed in a pained heap of frozen limbs. I could see Candace, naked and dead, descending the side of the ravine, a rictus grin on her face. I could see the eyes of the Striders behind her, and I crawled helplessly away from her. I spotted the butt of my gun, buried in the snow nearby, and grabbed at it, turning to aim it at the head of the Spectre. I'm already dead, Karen, Candace said, and soon you'll be too. As she drew closer, I pulled the trigger. I expected the bullet to hit her, but instead she just disappeared. The eyes behind her lingered, but Candace was gone. She'd never even been there in the first place. Above me, the moonlight shone through the trees into the ravine. In the distance, I could see the slope of a mountain. The Striders stood on either side, and I waited for them to come down and finish me off. I still had 1 bullet left, and as I looked at the eyes in the darkness, I thought about putting the gun to my head and pulling the trigger. It would be better than the alternative. One of the Striders dropped down into the ravine, chittering at me. Almost on instinct, I aimed the gun at it. It raised its spear and came for me. My finger hesitated on the trigger, but in the end I still pulled it. The Strider's head jerked backwards and it hit the ground dead. Its kin chattered loudly amongst themselves in response. I lowered the empty gun, then let it impotently drop from my trembling hands. Then there was silence. Silence, save for the low quaking of the earth. I looked down the ravine, and ahead I could see 2 birch trees side by side, as if they were waiting for me. Between them was my killer. The old god stared at me, and in the pale moonlight, I got my first good look at it as it advanced upon me. It stood at least 10 feet tall, perhaps even taller. Massive claws gleamed in the moonlight. Its skeletal face regarded me almost mockingly as I looked into its burning eyes. I felt a deep fear in my bones. It was almost instinctual. Whatever this was, this god, this demon, every part of me could sense its malignancy. And for that, I hated it. For trying to toy with my mind, I hated it. I stood tall as it approached me. The snow danced around us as I reached into my pocket and took out David's silver dagger. The old god paused, but only for a moment. It looked into my eyes, as if to say, "Really?" before letting out a terrible, inhuman scream. I watched as its horrible mouth opened. As the teeth parted, I saw countless rows of teeth deeper in its gullet, gnashing and opening. I replied with a scream of my own. Reaching deep into my soul, I summoned a primal howl to rival the god in front of me. Then, I charged. Perhaps it was an act of suicide. Perhaps I thought I really could kill it. The old god only met my challenge with bloodthirsty enthusiasm. It rushed me, cackling in that horrible language its subjects favored. Its claws raked at me, but it was too slow. I skidded between its legs and drove the dagger into its inner thigh. The old god snarled and tried to spin around to get at me, but I was faster. I put some distance between us, dagger still clutched in my hands. It bared its fangs at me before coming for me again, but this time I saw a limp. This time, it was slower. A massive claw struck the earth in front of me. I feinted to the side. The old god could not react in time. Its claws had swiped at where I had been. I managed to make it a few feet up the wall of the ravine before I leapt onto the creature's side. I caught a handful of its fur before I pulled myself onto its back. The old god writhed and squirmed beneath me, but I held tight, scaling the fur of its back until I was nearly on top of it. I could see the back of its neck, and without thinking, I plunged my knife deep into it. Another inhuman howl escaped the creature, and it fell forwards a bit. I almost toppled off of it, but I was not done yet. I could feel its hot blood pouring over my cold hands. Again and again, I brought the knife down into the back and side of its neck, tearing it out violently and leaving horrible jagged wounds. In my fervor, I left myself open. The god's massive arms swung out behind it and caught me by surprise. I felt a claw dig deep into my ribs before I was hurled away. I landed amongst the snow and rocks, and my world briefly went white as my skull collided with one particularly large piece of stone. A gash opened up in my forehead, and my ears began to ring. For a moment, I lay still, feeling the pain washing over me. But my racing heart told me I could not stay still for long. Slowly, I managed to look up, towards my enemy. The old god had a hand pressed against the side of its neck. It leaned against the wall of the ravine for support, but I could see the snow stained with blood beneath it. I could hear it wheezing as it struggled to breathe. Our eyes met again, and this time, I saw confusion and fear. I spotted the dagger in the snow beside me. My skull was aglow with pain and adrenaline. I could feel the wound in my side burning. How deep was it? Was it fatal? I didn't know, and in that moment, I didn't care. I seized the dagger and unleashed one final scream of defiance at the old god before I rushed in to claim my prey. The god held its ground, roaring defensively at me, but this seemed less of an act of aggression and more of a weak intimidation tactic. This was the defiant hiss of a cornered animal. I knew better. It recoiled, just enough to ground it. As I came, it swung at me with one heavy claw. It clipped my face and dashed me against the wall of the ravine. That offered it enough of a window to get a proper strike in. Before I could react, its talons pierced my stomach, and the pain overwhelmed me. I saw its mouth open in a triumphant roar. The rocks pressed into my back as the old god leaned in towards me, opening its mouth. I could see those gnashing teeth in its maw as it prepared to go in for the kill. I could imagine the crunch of my own skull before its teeth being the last sound I heard before everything ended. This was not how I wanted to die. Grunting in pain, I thrust the knife into its throat one final time as its head loomed closer. The god recoiled, mouth clamping shut. It screamed in pain and rage as blood trickled out of its mouth. But that scream was cut short as I forced the knife across its neck, ripping open its throat and unleashing a fresh torrent of warm blood. The old god stumbled backwards and collapsed. As it fell, I was dropped to the ground, its claws sliding out of me. I felt every painful inch of them. I sucked in a pained breath as I landed upon the rocks again. My hand instinctively went to my new wounds, and when I looked at it, it was covered in my own blood. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that the wound was mortal. I knew that this would kill me, but I would not be the first to die. My legs wobbled beneath me as I forced myself to stand up. The knife was held tightly in my hand. The only sensation I could feel was pain, but my only thought was to kill. The old god struggled to rise amongst its dead throes. Blood gushed from its slit throat as it tried to pick itself up, but it had no such luck. It was already dead, just like I was. Slowly, I advanced upon it, the eyes of the old god fixated on me, as if it did not understand how I could still stand, how I could still live with the injuries it had inflicted upon me. But in defiance of a god, I continued my advance in anticipation of the final blow. It tried to pull itself away from me, but its arms were too weak. I climbed on top of that horrible creature, and I raised my knife. All it could do was watch helplessly as I drove the dagger into its fucking heart. The old god let out a strangled sigh. Its body seized one last time as I twisted the dagger I'd buried so deep into its racing heart. The dagger snapped under the pressure, but the job was done. The old god's body twitched in spasms of death. Its eyes were wild and delirious. It stared up at me, still trying to understand that I had beaten it. I had killed it, and I stared right back at it. I looked down at it, watching it twitch, watching it die. In amongst the trees, hundreds of shining eyes watched me in silence. I looked up at them as I sat atop their dead god. My blood boiled despite the cold, and I felt nothing but primal hatred for every single one of these creatures. "Come on then!" I screamed. My voice was hoarse. The words were barely mine. But in that moment, I was ready to fight them to the death. I climbed off of the corpse of their deity. My body was weak. I felt as if I was ready to collapse, but somehow, I found the strength to outstretch my arms in an open challenge. "Come on, you fucks!" My challenge went unanswered. Slowly, I watched them retreat into the shadows, and just like that, they were gone. There were no more drums, no other sounds but the wind around me. Behind me, I heard a low grunt and turned to see the old god on its hands and knees. Blood seeped from its wounds, and its eyes regarded me placidly. For a moment, I expected it to rise and resume our battle. My legs wobbled beneath me, but it made no moves towards me. Instead, it remained still, watching me intently as my legs finally failed me, and I fell to my knees before it.
Intrepid little creature. Fascinating.
The voice I heard shook the earth beneath me, but it was not spoken by the god before me. Not verbally, at least. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You're the god of this place, aren't you? I asked. The entity did not reply. Perhaps its status needed no confirmation. I beat you. I beat your little challenge. I won. So now you owe me a boon, right? I asked. Right?
So says the law.
Then this is what I ask of you. There's a man, someone that I love, and he's going to die. Save him. The god regarded me silently before it spoke again.
No.
No? What do you mean, no? I killed you just now. I fucking killed you. And I'll fucking kill you again. And again until you grant me my fucking boon. Tears were starting to fill my eyes. Tears of rage and tears of sorrow. My vision faded from the edges, but I could have cared less in that moment. All that mattered was saving Matthew. Even if I died, at least he'd be cured. The god chuckled. It was a low, mournful sound.
I have not seen such dedication in so long. You really are a fascinating one.
Just save him. My voice was weak. I had gone from demanding to pleading. Please, I can't keep going without him. I can't. I'm not strong enough. Take me instead if you have to. He'll find someone else. Someone better. The tears were coming freely now. I'd been holding them back for so long, and there, in that ravine, and in front of the old god, I could hold them back no longer.
I'm sorry, warrior. If only I could. But he is beyond even my hope now.
A sick sensation filled my stomach as I realized what that meant. No. He can't be. Bring him back, please. Just bring him back.
The veil of death is beyond even me. I cannot grant your boon. I am sorry.
Tears streamed down my cheeks as I looked up at the massive beast before me. The helplessness I felt was something unlike anything I'd ever felt before, and it gnawed at me. I had done so much. I had defeated a god, and it was not enough. The god stared down at me, quiet and solemn as I cried. As I let every inch of misery escape me, it was patient, and it let me grieve. In the distance, I heard a howl and looked up. The old god waited for me. What about David? I asked. He would have asked you to cure him. Can you do that? The god continued to stare for a moment. Then it slowly began to turn away. Where are you going? I asked. What about David? Can you help him? Please, that's my boon. Cure him. The snow began to pick up. The god left a trail of blood in its wake. I watched as the silver dagger fell from its wounds and was lost in the snow. In mere seconds, the conditions had turned from a light flurry into a pure whiteout. I tried to stand, tried to follow in the footsteps of the old god, but the winds were too powerful. After only a few steps, my strength failed me entirely. I hit the rocks again and my muscles would no longer obey me. I had used up the last of my strength. All I could do was watch through the snow and tears as the old god disappeared into the blizzard. Somewhere in the distance I saw massive shapes against the sky, things I could not clearly make out, but that were far greater than the beast I had just fought. I could see darkness quickly creeping in from the edges of my vision, and I felt so tired. I just wanted to sleep. Damn the cold, Damn the pain. I just wanted to drift away. In my fading consciousness, I saw a shape enter the ravine, something massive and hulking. Amongst the flurries, I could make out a familiar pair of green eyes. The shape drew nearer to me. I blinked, and as I did, it got so much closer. I felt a warm claw against my body as I rolled onto my back, and I found myself looking up into a maw filled with massive canine teeth. He's going to eat me, I remember thinking, and for a moment, I was all right with that. Dying was all right with me. Matthew would be there at least, and maybe we could start again. A heavy weight settled over me, warm like a blanket. I could feel arms around me, and I felt weightless as I faded away. I awoke to find a warm body on top of mine. Arms held me tightly, and I could see a tuft of black hair in the morning sunlight. Autumn leaves fell lazily down and landed on us, and while there was a nip in the air, it was not as cold as I had anticipated. Slowly, I sat up. I felt the figure on top of me shift. A quick glance confirmed my suspicions that it was David. He was mostly nude, but that didn't bother me. I had other concerns. I lifted my shirt and pressed my hands against where the old god had stabbed me. I felt my own skin, smooth and unbroken. No sign of any injuries. Looking around, I saw that we were still in the ravine, but the snow was gone. It was as if it had never been there in the first place. I scanned the trees above the ravine suspiciously, looking for anything out of place. As I could tell, nothing moved behind them. I climbed to my feet. My body ached from days of hiking, but I was alive. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My heart skipped a beat and I looked over to see something emerge from the trees. But this time it wasn't a creature or a god. Matthew? He looked just as he had when we were kids. A warm, boyish smile, messy brown hair, and that gray hoodie he'd always worn. He raised a hand to wave at me and I took a step towards him. Karen? I looked back to see David looking up at me. He sounded half asleep still. David, I looked back to where Matthew had been, but all I could see was trees. Nothing behind them. What happened? David asked. Where are we? I remember the change, but I don't know what happened next. Did we win? Yeah, I said softly. Yeah, I think we did. How do you feel? Good, David said. A little hazy, but I'm all right. I nodded, looked back towards the trees. There was nothing there. Nothing watching us. Nothing we could see, at least. I'm glad, I said softly. We should get moving. I think we're done here. David watched as I headed to where I'd seen Matthew in the trees. He watched as I began to climb out of the ravine, and after a moment, he followed. The walk back should have taken days, but as we passed through the trees, I saw an end to the forest up ahead and stepped out into a familiar clearing. 4 cars covered in autumn leaves sat waiting, and I recognized my own nearby. Reaching into my pocket, I found my keys and the car unlocked when I hit the button for them. David slowly approached his own car and paused to look back at me. For a moment, I expected him to say something, but no words came out. Maybe there was nothing left to say. We both left without saying goodbye. Matthew passed quietly in his sleep on October 2nd. He was gone before I'd even made it to the national park. I'm told it was peaceful, just like he'd always wanted. I wasn't there, but I don't think he minded. He wouldn't have wanted me to watch him die. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad that my final words to him were to tell him I loved him. My only regret is that I never said it sooner. The other night I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was short, but to the point. Hey Karen, sorry if this is a little out of the blue, but I wanted to thank you for what you did. If it's alright, I was thinking that maybe we could get together sometime. I understand if you don't want to. I'm still a stranger to you, but if it's all right, I'd like to be more. David. I pondered his email for a few moments. I thought of the way David and I had both driven off without saying goodbye. I regretted that. I regretted a lot of things. Slowly, I typed a reply to his email. I can't say how many revisions I went through until I found a way to say what I wanted to say. But in time, I found a way that suited me. And when I sent that email, I found that I was smiling for the first time in a very long time.